So a question that's come up recently has been how we choose the stories we cover on Behind the Palms. And usually it involves me going to the Historical Society, sitting down with the team there and looking at interesting pictures and listening to the team talk about interesting stories they've recently uncovered. This story started out with a photo of this plane called the Big Fish that we found out was doing flights to the Bahamas out of West Palm Beach in 1918. Which sounded really early, so I Googled what the first international airport was, and Google said Hounslow Heath Aerodrome, also known as London Heathrow. And that was founded in August 1919. So if the Big Fish was doing flights to the Bahamas almost a year earlier in 1918, wouldn't that make West Palm Beach the first international airport? Okay, now I know people are gonna say the Big Fish was a seaplane operating out of a seaplane base, not an airport. But technically speaking, a seaplane base is a type of airport. And furthermore, an international airport is defined as an airport used by international airlines with flights to and from different countries. Some definitions require the flights to be regularly scheduled, and others require customs and immigration. But at that time, it wasn't even a thing since the Passport Act wasn't passed until a couple years later. So, anyways, this is the Big Fish, or at least a model version of it. A World War I era seaplane, or flying boat as they were called. The Big Fish was flying paying customers from the docks of the Lake Worth Lagoon in West Palm Beach to inlets and waterways all over Florida. But some passengers wanted to travel even further out. Before I get there, I want to back up about 13 years. To properly tell this story, a couple aviation history basics are necessary to set the stage. In 1903, the Wright brothers conducted their first successful flight in a rickety plane that flew in a straight line for 120 feet, less than 10 feet off the ground. Over the next couple years, they made a bunch of improvements to their original plane and were able to fly distances of 24 miles in under 40 minutes. By this time, engineers all over the world had started iterating on the Wright's plane design, figuring out ways to make it more stable, easier to control, and faster. Much, much faster. These planes, however, required large, open fields as makeshift runways. Airfields at this point were pretty much non-existent, so destinations were limited. 1910 led to the first powered seaplane flight, which opened up many more destinations. Now, any lake or river big enough was potentially a place to take off and land. This, in combination with year-round flying weather, made South Florida particularly attractive to aviators.
The first heavier-than-air flight occurred in 1911 when John McCurdy brought his aeroplane to Palm Beach to do test and demonstration flights.
McCurdy brought his seaplanes and was doing flights over Palm Beach, which in 1911, if you can imagine, the town was still pretty small and aviation was really in its infancy. So you can imagine people standing and seeing a flying machine for the first time.
When John McCurdy brought his test flights into the area, it was a sensation. It was an exciting experience for people. It was all over the news that this airplane was coming in and doing test flights. In 1912, Howard Coffin brought a plane from the Royal Poinciana Hotel and flew it over Palm Beach. Before World War I, the area was sparsely occupied.
Lake Worth, which we now call the Intracoastal, was a natural for seaplanes. You had a nice long body of water, real easy, no highways where planes could take off and give passengers a remarkable view of downtown West Palm Beach and its office buildings on one side and the marvelous mansions and hotels of Palm Beach on the other as they headed off to some exotic destination.
Aviation was an exciting new activity that would have attracted tourists from all over.
Palm Beach Life magazine actually had added aviation times to its sports section.
Tourist-based flights began not long after that 1911 flight by McCurdy, and you start seeing advertisements and reviews in the newspapers from tourists who actually made it up in the air. Florida had the perfect environment for aviation. It was summer year-round. By 1914, Palm Beach Life magazine started advertising airplane rides for tourists.
But they weren't doing international flights quite yet. Not until a pair of aviators named Rod Wanamaker and Glenn Curtiss moved to town.
American Trans-Oceanic Company was formed in 1914 by Rodman Wanamaker and Glenn Curtiss. Their main goal was to have the first transatlantic crossing. Rod Wanamaker was an American businessman and heir to the Wanamaker's department store fortune. He was enthusiastic about this new form of transportation, aviation. He was a member of the New York Aero Club and founded an annual trophy to women who reached the highest altitude. Wanamaker had a second home in Palm Beach, which was designed by Addison Meisner, who eventually would sell it to the Kennedy family.
Wanamaker recruited notorious engineer Glenn Curtiss to help him build an aircraft that was capable of transatlantic flight. Together, they started American Trans-Oceanic Airways, ATO for short, in response to the $10,000 1913 challenge prize offered by the London newspaper The Daily Mail. Glenn Curtiss, like a lot of early aviators at the time, started out building bicycles, then motorcycles, and in 1908, Curtiss was invited to join the Aerial Experiment Association, an aviation research group founded by Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone guy, who called Glenn Curtiss the greatest motor expert in the country. In June 1911, Curtiss received pilot's license numero uno from Aero Club of America. In 1912, Curtiss produced the two-seat Flying Fish, a smaller prototype of the future H model, Big Fish, that was classified as a flying boat because the hull sat directly on the water. By World War I, the Curtiss H model hit the production line, and the Curtiss Airplane Company became the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. After World War I, military contracts dried up, and a lot of surplus Curtiss flying boats were being repurposed for passenger flights. One of the first was the Big Fish.
The Big Fish was a Curtiss H-16 flying seaboat. It was built in 1916.
The Big Fish was a converted 12-passenger plane that ran people to Havana and to the Bahamas. And then there was a smaller 6-passenger plane that went down to Miami.
Glenn Curtiss and Rodman Wanamaker set up a hangar in West Palm Beach, and they started offering flights to Miami, Key West, Havana, and Florida's West Coast.
They would advertise flights on the Big Fish for $2.50 just to fly up in the air and take a look around Lake Worth.
The commercial aviation industry found an eager local audience in Palm Beach. Palm Beach's resort guests were excited about aerial joyrides around the island. By the war's end in 1918, ATO was operating multiple seaplane bases in addition to their Palm Beach hangar near the west end of the Flagler Bridge, which housed 7 planes. ATO began selling seats on the Big Fish from multiple destinations around Florida and the East Coast, from quick joy hops between Miami and Key West to marathon 18-hour-plus flights between Palm Beach and Atlantic City and New York. And back then, there was no in-flight beverage service. Yeesh. Passengers could make the 67-mile flight from Miami to Palm Beach in a little over an hour for $50, which is almost $1,000 today. More importantly, ATO was advertising in a 1919 issue of Palm Beach Life magazine for flights from Palm Beach to Bimini via Miami, a distance of 124 miles, for $100. But ATO had competition from another early operator named Arthur Burns, Pappy Chalk. Pappy had been flying planes since 1911 and later founded a fledgling air charter outfit in Miami around 1917 called Red Arrow Flying Service.
After serving in the Army as a pilot, Arthur Pappy Chalk returned to Miami in 1917. Pappy started a private air service at the docks of the Royal Palm Hotel.
As aviation was booming, it was booming in other parts of Florida as well. Tampa Bay and Miami, and they would become much bigger aviation centers for pioneering aviators. But of course, you couldn't beat the wonderful flying over Palm Beach that drew a lot of people that wanted to fly those seaplanes.
Pappy came back from Europe in 1918 and renamed his charter company Chalk's Flying Service. The airline's first base of operations was on the dock of the Royal Palm Hotel in Miami's Biscayne Bay. His ticket counter was under a beach umbrella, and he took reservations with a single crank telephone hanging from a pole overhead. Pappy began flying charters to Bimini in the Bahamas in a 3-seat Stinson Voyager, and by 1920, he had a handful of seaplanes that were shuttling tourists back and forth between Miami and Nassau. So who is doing regularly scheduled international flights first? It's hard to say since aviation was a brand new and unregulated industry. There aren't a lot of written records or flight plans left behind by those early pilots who flew the Caribbean over 100 years ago. We have some old advertisements, but the best and most conclusive evidence we found was the 1921 Aircraft Yearbook, which says, "Since the fall of 1918, continuous service according to the season has been maintained between Florida coast towns and points in the West Indies such as Havana, Nassau, and Bimini." It also specifically calls out ATO. Whether it was ATO, Chalks, or even some under-the-radar pilot working solo, we may never know exactly who was first, but whoever or wherever it was, we do know that this little stretch of intercoastal waterway was serving international flights well before London's Heathrow Airport was. For more stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Go ahead and give us a little thumbs up,